The morning, the new Duke of Marrowmere dismissed the old man who had tended the South Gardens for 40 years. The frost had not yet lifted from the box hedges, and Eleanor Hart stood at the head of the kitchen passage, with a basket of cut holly going cold against her ribs. She watched through the tall window as the gardener, Thomas, set down his spade in the gravel, with a care that broke something quiet in her chest, removed his hat, and walked away down the long avenue of limes, without once looking back. The Duke had not come out to say it himself. He had sent his steward with a folded note and a half-quarter's wages, and the room behind him, full of breakfast china and the cold blue light of a January that had no mercy in it, had gone on as though nothing at all had been decided. To the household the dismissal was a line in a ledger. To Eleanor it was the first stone of a wall she could already feel rising. She had been at Marrowmere 11 months by then, hired as companion to the late Duke's small ward, a boy of 6, named Henry, who did not speak. The old Duke had died in the autumn, and the title had passed sideways and far to a cousin no one in the house had ever met, a soldier returned from the long wars with a reputation for coldness and a face, when he finally arrived, that gave the reputation nothing to argue with. He was tall and dark and held himself the way men hold themselves when they have learned that stillness is safer than feeling. He had walked the corridors of his inheritance like a man inspecting a fortification. And on his second morning he had begun, with no ceremony and no malice that anyone could name, to take the old house apart. Stay with me. Because what the Duke did next, he did believing himself unobserved, and that belief was the whole of his mistake. Eleanor set down her basket. She went out into the cold without her shawl, which she would regret within the minute, and she crossed the kitchen garden to the place where Thomas had left his spade upright in the frozen bed. There was a small thing she needed to do, and she did it without permitting herself to think about whether it was wise. She knelt at the base of the south wall. Beneath the espaliered pear the old man had trained for 30 years into the shape of a candelabra, and she found in the frost-hard soil the row of crocus bulbs he had set the week before, the ones he had told her, with his hands shaking slightly over the trowel, were the last he would put in before he was too old to kneel. She pressed the soil back over them with her bare fingers. She did not want them disturbed by whatever the new Duke intended for the grounds. It was a foolish small loyalty, and she performed it as a kind of prayer. What she did not know was that the library of Marrowmere had a window that looked directly down onto the south wall, and that the new Duke, who slept badly and rose before the servants, was standing at that window with a cup of cooling coffee in his hand, watching a woman in a gray gown kneel in the frost to bury something with her bare hands. His name was Adrian Vale, and he had buried things himself in places he did not let himself revisit. He watched her press the soil flat. He watched her sit back on her heels and look at the bare pear tree for a long moment, the way one looks at the work of a person one will not see again. Then she rose, brushed the dirt from her hands and went back inside, and the Duke discovered that he had been holding his breath without any reason a soldier would have accepted. By the time Eleanor returned to the kitchen passage, her hands were raw and her teeth had begun to chatter, and Mrs. Pell, the housekeeper, met her with a face folded into disapproval. "You will catch your death for a handful of bulbs," the housekeeper said, "and for a man who is gone and will not thank you." She was not unkind. She had served the house for 30 years and had watched it lose, in the space of one autumn, the master she understood, and gain a master she did not. Her sharpness was fear wearing its work clothes. The new Duke does not want sentiment in his house. She went on lower now. He wants accounts that balance. You would do well to remember which you are. And there it was, the first naming, spoken in the warm fugue of the kitchen, with the kettle ticking on the range. You are the boy's companion, and nothing more, a governess, in all but the word. Do not imagine the South Garden is any concern of yours. A governess, and nothing more. Eleanor heard the sentence settle over her like a dust sheet over furniture in a closed room. She did not argue it. She had learned, in the years since her father's death, had turned her from a clergyman's educated daughter into a woman who must earn her bread, that arguing a label only fixed it more firmly in the air. She warmed her hands at the range, took up a fresh basket, and went to find Henry, who would be where he always was at this hour, in the cold East Gallery, sitting on the floor, beneath the portrait of a woman no one ever mentioned. The boy did not look up when she came. He was turning a small brass key over and over in his fingers, a key to nothing anyone had ever found, that he had carried since before she came to the house, and would not be parted from. Eleanor sat down on the floor beside him, not too close, and after a while she began to tell him in a low, even voice about the crocus bulbs, about how they were sleeping under the frost, and would wake in March, whether anyone gave them leave or not, about how some things were stronger than the people who tried to be rid of them. Henry did not answer. He never answered. His fingers slowed on the key, though, and he leaned, by the width of a hair, into the warmth of her side. And Eleanor counted it as she counted it every day a victory worth more than wages. She did not know that the Duke had followed the sound of her voice along the gallery, that he stood now just beyond the doorway with his back against the cold paneling, listening to a woman explain the resilience of flowers to a child who had not spoken a word since the night his mother died. The Duke had been told the boy was simple. He had been told a great many things about his inheritance that he was beginning to suspect were the inventions of people who found the truth inconvenient. He listened until she finished, and then he walked away very quietly. And for the rest of that day Adrian Vale was shorter with his steward than the steward felt he had deserved. The dismissals continued through the week because the new Duke had come to Marrowmere with the conviction that the house had been bleeding money under its old soft management, and he meant to stop the wound. He let go 2 of the underfootmen. He questioned the wine accounts and the coal accounts and the long-standing pension paid to a blind former coachman in the village, and each economy was, on the page, entirely reasonable, and each one landed in the house like a small grief. The staff began to move differently in his presence, the way deer move when they have learned the meadow is no longer safe. And through all of it, the Duke watched Eleanor, though he would not have called it watching, and would have been coldly affronted had anyone suggested it. He watched her stop on the back stairs to help a kitchen girl, who had dropped a tray, kneeling in her gray gown to gather the broken pieces so the girl would not be the only one found at fault. He watched her, on the bitter Thursday, give her own portion of meat at the servants' table to the new scullery boy who had come to them half-starved, and do it so smoothly that the boy never understood he had been given anything. He watched her carry Henry on her hip through the long, cold corridors because the boy's legs tired, and no one else would trouble to notice. None of these things were singular in themselves. That was precisely what undid him. He had spent 11 years among men who performed their virtues loudly and abandoned them the moment a price was named, and here was a woman, performing hers when she believed no one of consequence was looking, at a steady cost to herself, expecting nothing. He had learned to read men the way other men read weather, by the small involuntary signs that betray what the mouth denies, and he found that he could not read her at all, because there was no gap in her between what she did and what she was. It unsettled him more than any enemy had. On the Friday, he overheard her in the still room with Mrs. Bully, the 2 of them measuring out the last of the autumn preserves, and he heard the housekeeper say not unkindly that the new master would likely close the still-room economies along with the rest, and he heard Eleanor answer that if he did, she would teach the kitchen girls to bottle fruit the cheaper way her mother had used in the parsonage, so that nothing in the house would go without on her account. She had spoken of his economies without bitterness, as a problem to be solved, rather than a wound to be nursed, and the Duke had stood in the cold passage and felt the particular discomfort of a man discovering that the person he has wronged has already forgiven him for wrongs he has not yet finished committing. He did not close the still room. He told his steward that afternoon to leave the preserves alone, and he gave no reason, and the steward wrote it in the ledger with a small question mark he did not dare to speak aloud. The witnessing scene, the one that broke the last of his composure, came on the night the chimney in the nursery wing smoked so badly that the fire had to be let die, and the wing went cold as a tomb. Eleanor did not call for a footman. She stripped her own bed of its blankets and carried them down the freezing passage. And when the Duke, prowling his sleepless house at 1 a.m, opened the nursery door without knocking, he found her sitting on the floor, with her back against the cold hearth, and the boy asleep across her lap, while she herself sat in nothing but her thin nightgown and shawl, shivering, reading aloud from a book she could barely see by the light of a single guttering candle. She was reading a story about a garden. She did not stop when the door opened. She looked up, saw who it was, and held his gaze with no fear in it, and no apology, and went on reading to the child, as though the master of the house were a draft she had decided to ignore. He stood in the doorway a long time. Then he said, in a voice that came out lower and rougher than he intended, "You will freeze." It was a command shaped like a warning, the only shape his concern knew how to take. Take the candle. Take the boy to the blue room. It has a fire that draws. Do it now. And Eleanor, who had been braced for a reprimand, who had half expected to be the next economy, looked at him for a moment that lasted 3 full beats of her own startled heart. Her mouth said, "Thank you, Your Grace," level and correct. Her hands gathering the sleeping boy were not quite steady, and it was not the cold that made them so. She felt the exact place in the doorway where he stood. She felt it the way one feels the edge of a cliff in the dark. He carried the candle for her. He did not offer. He simply took it from the floor and walked ahead of them down the passage to the blue room, and crouched at the cold grate, and built the fire himself, a duke on his knees among the kindling, his fine coat dusted with ash. And Eleanor stood holding the child, and watched the most exacting man she had ever served coax a flame from nothing, with his own hands, and understood that she had no framework whatsoever for what she was seeing. He worked the way she imagined he had once worked in the field, without waste, laying the kindling in a careful lattice and feeding it the smallest sticks first, sheltering the new flame with his cupped hand until it caught and held. When it was burning steadily, he did not rise at once. He stayed crouched before it a moment longer than the task required, watching the fire as a man watches something he has not allowed himself in a long while. And Eleanor saw in the orange light that his hands bore the small white scars of a soldier and the ink stain of a man who had been writing letters late, and she found she could not look away from them. Then he stood and brushed the ash from his coat with 2 short strokes, and the mask came back down over his face like a visor. He told her to put the boy in the bed nearest the fire, and to take the truckle for herself, and to send for more coal in the morning on his authority and not the housekeeper's. He paused at the door. For a moment it seemed he might say something further, and Eleanor waited for it with a breathlessness she despised in herself, and then he only said that she was to keep the candle, and went out, and she stood in a warming room with the sleeping child in the borrowed light, and did not understand why her eyes were stinging. That you do not yet understand him is the point. She did not understand him either, neither of them. That night understood the other at all, and the not understanding was the whole engine of the thing. In the days that followed, the house learned a new arithmetic, though it did not know it was learning. The Duke found reasons to be near the nursery wing. He asked Eleanor questions he had no practical need to ask. About the boy, about the boy's habits, about the brass key Henry would not surrender. He stood in doorways. He issued commands that, examined closely, were small mercies in uniform. Sit down. You have been on your feet since dawn. Eat something before you go up. I can see you have not. Do not carry the coal scuttle. That is not your work. Each one she received as coldness, because coldness was the only register in which she had been taught to expect attention from men of his rank, and each one the listener could hear for what it truly was. The body knows before the mind permits. Her body had begun to know. His wound surfaced on an afternoon of low gray light in the long gallery, beneath the portrait of the woman no one named. Eleanor had brought Henry there as she did each day, and she found the Duke already standing before the painting, with his hands clasped behind his back, very still. She would have withdrawn, but Henry, who fled most people, walked directly to the Duke and held up the brass key, the way a child offers the one treasure he possesses, and the Duke went down on one knee to look at it, and something in his face came apart very quietly. "I knew her," he said, "not to Eleanor, not quite to the boy. Before any of this, before the title, before the wars." He turned the small key in the child's open palm, without taking it. "She was my sister, Henry's mother. I was in Spain when the letter came, and I did not read it for 3 days because I was a coward about letters, and by the time I answered she was already a month in the ground." His voice did not break. It did something worse. It stayed perfectly level. "I came home to claim a house I never wanted, and I found her son in it. And I have not been able to look at him until today, because every time I do, I see the 3 days I did not open the letter." He closed the boy's fingers gently over the key. This was hers. She used to lock the garden door with it, so the deer would not get the roses. He has kept it all this while. He was quiet a moment, and his hand stayed closed, around the child's small hand, around the key. We were not a close family, the Vales. We did not say things. She wrote to me through all the years in Spain, every month, and I answered perhaps 1 letter in 3 because I told myself there would be time, that the war would end, and I would go home and we would say everything then. He looked at the painted face above them, the woman with the boy's exact grave eyes. "There is no later. That is the thing they do not tell a young man going off to make his fortune. He spends the whole of his youth purchasing a later that never comes to market." The boy leaned his head against the Duke's shoulder, and the Duke went very still, the way a man goes still when a wild thing has chosen, against all sense, to trust him. And Eleanor saw him decide not to move, not to break it, and she understood that whatever this man had been before he came to Merrowmere, he was learning, very late, and at great cost, how to hold still and let himself be approached. The wound had a name now, and the name was guilt, and it had been wearing the costume of coldness, because guilt, in a proud man, almost always does. Eleanor did not offer him comfort. She understood with the swift, sure instinct that was the truest thing about her, that comfort would have been an intrusion he could not have survived in front of the child. Instead, she said quietly, she trained the pear tree on the south wall. Thomas told me the candelabra shape. It was her design. And she watched the Duke receive this small fact, this proof that some piece of his sister's hand still lived in the frozen garden he had nearly given over to a stranger's improvement, and watched him understand, perhaps for the first time, what it was that the old gardener had been keeping, and what he, the Duke, had so nearly thrown away with a folded note and a half-quarter's wages. If this story is reaching you, stay until the garden wakes. I promise you the spring is coming. The trouble, when it came wearing diamonds, and a perfectly correct smile. The Dowager Lady Castleridge was the late Duke's aunt, a woman who had spent 60 years as the unquestioned arbiter of who in 3 counties was and was not worth knowing, and she descended upon Merrowmere in February with a retinue and a purpose. The purpose had a name, and the name was Miss Augusta Finch, her great-niece. 22, accomplished, dowered with £8,000, and the kind of polished beauty that had been assembled deliberately over a lifetime for exactly this market. The Dowager had decided that the new Duke, however cold, however lately a soldier, must marry, and must marry within the order she protected, and she had arrived to arrange it the way she had arranged 40 years of such matters, by sheer force of certainty. She took in the household with one sweep of her lorgnette, and found it wanting, and she found Eleanor wanting most of all. "Who is the grey creature with the child?" she asked the housekeeper, in the entrance hall, in a voice pitched to Carrie. "The companion? At Merrowmere we did not used to let the upper servants drift about the family rooms. She has the manner of a woman who imagines herself something." Footnote. There it was, The second voicing in the great cold entrance hall with the footmen standing like statues, and Eleanor herself 3 steps up the stair, close enough to hear every word, and far enough that the dowager could pretend she had not meant her to. A governess, with ideas. The most tiresome kind of poverty. See that she keeps to the nursery. For a fortnight, the house belonged to the dowager and her diamond. Miss Finch played the pianoforte in the drawing-room each evening with genuine skill and arranged herself near the Duke at dinner with a strategist's care, and the dowager narrated the courtship to anyone who would listen as though it were already a settled thing. And the Duke endured it. He was correct to Miss Finch, and cold to the dowager, and increasingly, unmistakably drawn toward the nursery wing, where a woman in a gray gown was teaching his sister's son to trust the world again. The dowager was not a fool. She saw the direction of his stillness, and she began with the patience of a woman who had never once been thwarted, to close the door. It closed on a Tuesday, in the drawing-room, after dinner, in front of the assembled house guests and the dowager's diamond and the steward and 3 footmen, when the dowager set down her coffee, and remarked with the air of one merely tidying a household irregularity, that the companion would be leaving Merrowmere at the quarter-day. "I have written to a family in Yorkshire who require a governess and cannot be particular," she said, smiling at the Duke over the rim of her cup. "It is more than the creature could hope for. One cannot keep a young unmarried woman, of no family, loitering about an unmarried Duke. People will say things. People have already begun to say them." She turned her smile, then, full upon Eleanor, who had been summoned to bring the boy down to make his good nights, and who stood now frozen in the center of the beautiful, cruel room with Henry's hand in hers. "We are doing you a kindness," the dowager said, soft as a knife going in. "A governess, and nothing more, in a house where she has begun to forget it, is a sad and dangerous thing. You will thank me, in time." The third voicing. The room full of witnesses. The boy's hand tightening in hers. Eleanor said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not make it worse. And she had her pride, which was the last thing they had not yet taken, and she meant to keep it. She made Henry's bow for him, gentle hand at his small shoulder, and she walked from the room with her chin level and her eyes dry, and only when the door had closed behind her, and she was alone in the cold passage, did she put her back against the wall and let herself shake, once, hard, the way a tree shakes when the axe is bitten deep but not yet through. She would go to Yorkshire. She would lose the boy. Wend. She would lose the South Garden, and the sleeping crocus, and the man on his knees among the kindling. And she would survive it, because surviving was the one skill her life had taught her. Past all argument that night, she did not sleep. She sat at the window of her small, cold room and watched the moon move across the frozen garden, and she let herself, for the first time in many months, count what she was losing. Item by item, the way one counts coins before a journey one cannot afford. She was losing the boy, who had begun to lean into her side, who had begun to slow his fingers on the key when she spoke. She was losing the South Garden and the sleeping crocus that no one in the house but she now knew were even there. She was losing the small kingdom of usefulness she had built out of nothing in 11 months, the kitchen girls who came to her with their troubles, the scullery boy who was no longer half-starved, the place at the servants' table that had become, without her quite noticing, a kind of home. And she was losing something she did not have a name for and would not give one. A thing made of doorways and firelight and the white scars on a pair of hands. A thing she had been careful never to let herself believe in, because believing in it was the surest way to be broken by its absence. She pressed her forehead to the cold glass. She thought of the Yorkshire family who could not be particular, and of the years of other people's children that stretched ahead of her, gone gray before her time, a governess and nothing more. Exactly as they had all said. At some point in the long dark, she made the only decision left to her that was hers to make. She would not creep away. She would not let the boy wake to find her gone without a word. Whatever it cost her, she would say goodbye to him properly. In the daylight, before them all. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that the Duke had not spoken in that drawing-room because he had already gone, in the silence after the dowager's smile, very still and very cold, to the place inside himself where the soldier lived, and had begun with the soldier's patience to plan. He had sent a rider that same night to the village. He had sat up until dawn with a letter spread on the library desk, the letter from Spain, the one he had not opened for 3 days, and he had read it through at last, all of it, his sister's hand. And at the bottom, in the postscript he had never reached, a single line. Look after Henry, he trusts so few. And there will be, I think, someone who comes to the house who will know how to love him. Be kind to her when she comes. The Duke read the postscript a great many times. Then he folded the letter, and he put on his coat, and he went out into the gardens in the grey hour before the house woke, and he found the old gardener, Thomas, whom his own rider had fetched back from the village in the dark, waiting for him at the south wall. And the two men stood a long time over the place where a woman had once buried bulbs with her bare hands. The quarter day fell on a morning of thin, bright sun, the first the winter had offered, and the dowager had arranged the leaving as she arranged everything, as a kind of theater. The household was assembled in the great hall to see the companion off, the family on the stairs and the servants ranged along the walls, and the post-chaise waiting in the drive with Eleanor's single trunk already strapped behind. Miss Finch stood at the dowager's side in pale blue. The Duke stood at the head of the stairs, and his face gave nothing. And the dowager mistook the nothing for assent. Eleanor came down dressed for travel, holding Henry's hand because the boy had refused, in the only loud, wordless way he had to be parted from her one moment before he must. She had meant to make her goodbyes quietly. She got as far as the foot of the stairs. "That will do," said the dowager, rising, gracious in victory. "The chaise is waiting. The child will be quite recovered by luncheon. Come, Henry, let go of the woman's hand." And the boy did not let go, and the dowager, with the faintest hardening of her gracious face, reached to part them. The Duke came down the stairs. He crossed the great hall in the silence that followed, past the diamond and the assembled guests and the statues that were footmen, and he stopped before Eleanor and the boy, and the whole bright, cold room held its breath. He looked at the dowager once levelly, the look a man gives a fortification he has decided to take. Then he went down on one knee before the child, as he had done in the gallery, and he held out his open hand, and Henry, after a long, trembling moment, placed the brass key into the Duke's palm. The Duke closed his fingers over it. He rose. He turned to the room, and into the silence the morning had made. He said the thing he had come down the stairs to say, and he said at once, "Miss Hartstays, she is to be my wife." The words landed in the great hall like a stone into a still pond, and the rings went out from them across every face in the room. The dowager's hand, half lifted toward the boy, stopped in the air, and did not complete its motion. Miss Finch's careful composure flickered, and then, to her lasting credit, settled into something almost like relief, for she had been arranged into this morning, no more willingly than Eleanor had. The servants along the walls did not move and did not speak, but something passed through them, a current, a warmth, the sound a house makes when it recognizes that the right thing has at last been done. Mrs. Saft. Pell, the housekeeper, put one hand briefly over her mouth. The dowager found her voice, though it came out smaller than she had ever permitted it to be. "You cannot," she said. "A girl of no family. The settlements, the name, You cannot mean it." But the certainty had gone out of the words even as she spoke them, because the door that had opened behind the Duke was the front door, and through it had come the old gardener Thomas, hat in his weathered hands, and behind Thomas the village solicitor with a leather case. And the Duke had arranged his own theater, quietly, in the dark, while the dowager believed herself the only one who knew how such things were staged. "My sister left a letter," the Duke said, and now he spoke to the dowager alone, and his voice was not cruel, which was somehow worse for her than cruelty would have been. "She asked me to be kind to the woman who would come to love her son. I was 3 days too late to answer my sister once. I do not intend to be late a second time." He turned from the dowager as one turns from a matter concluded. He looked at Eleanor, and the cold went out of his face entirely, and he said, low, so that it was almost only for her, "I have watched you give away your supper and your blankets and your sleep to people who could never repay you when you believed no one of any importance was looking. I was looking. I have been looking since the morning you knelt in the frost. Stay." Eleanor Hart, who had not wept in front of them, who had kept her pride through 3 namings and a fortnight of diamonds, felt the careful wall she had built come down all at once, not in grief, but in something she had no practice at and no defense against. She did not give a speech. She had never been a woman of speeches. She looked at the man before her, and at the boy holding to her skirts, and at the old gardener turning his hat in his hands by the door, and she said the only word that mattered. And she said it quietly. Yes. And then, because she was herself to the last, and would not be made into a creature who only received, she added, "But Thomas comes back. The South Garden was hers. He keeps it." And the Duke, who had brought the old man home in the dark for exactly this, inclined his head. And it was done. They were married in the village church in the first week of March, with the household in the pews and the dowager not among them, for she had withdrawn to her own estate to recover from a defeat she would spend some months learning to call in company, a thing she had always foreseen. There was no crowd and no spectacle. There was the boy, in a new coat, standing very straight beside the woman, who was now in every way but the giving of birth his mother. There was the old gardener at the back of the church, hat against his chest, and there was a single line of melting frost along the churchyard wall where the sun had finally reached. By the time the wedding party returned to Merrowmere, the afternoon had gone gold, that particular low gold of an English late winter that promises the spring without yet delivering it. And the new Duchess of Merrowmere did not go first to the great hall, or the drawing room, or any of the saturated rooms that were now hers. She went, still in her wedding clothes, out through the kitchen passage and across the garden to the south wall, and the Duke came with her. And the boy ran ahead of them both. At the base of the espaliered pear tree, in the bed where a woman had once knelt in the frost to bury something with her bare hands, the soil had broken. A row of green spears had pushed up through the cold earth, and at the tip of the nearest one, just beginning to show its color, was the first crocus of the year, purple as a bruise, stubborn as grief, alive. Henry crouched over it. He put out one finger and did not quite touch it. And then the boy, who had not spoken a word in 2 years, looked up at the woman who had told him, on a January morning, that some things were stronger than the people who tried to be rid of them. And he said, in a voice rusty and small and entirely his own, "It woke up." Eleanor knelt in the soil in her wedding dress, and did not care, and the Duke knelt beside her, and somewhere above them the old gardener, come quietly through the gate to see his last bulbs flower, stood with his hat in his hands and his weathered face wet, and the brass key that unlocked the garden door hung now on a ribbon at the boy's neck, where it would stay. The frost came back that night, as frost does, and lay white over the whole sleeping garden by morning. The crocus had opened, though, and the ones behind it would open after, all through the slow, bright lengthening of the year, because they had been planted by hands that loved the place, and kept by hands that learned to, and nothing the cold could do would call them back into the dark. Thank you for staying until the garden woke. If Eleanor's winter moved you, leave a word below for the old gardener, who knew before any of them which things were worth keeping.